we talk about power and responsibility being opposite sides of the same coin, that power without responsibility is tyranny and responsibility without power is slavery. And where you have, like you do on the border so frequently, the power and responsibility are divorced.
People on the border culturally resist outsiders. What is it to be from here and try to relate to the very strong cultural traditions that there are, and what is it to also be part of the global community? I think it's always in tension, specifically for the reasons that have been already brought up, is that we have very big problems with the environment that go beyond our traditional capabilities of dealing with them.
And here in particular, you have governments draw a line and call it a border, and you're two different countries all of a sudden, but the fact is it's all one watershed. And you're all drinking the same water out of the same river. And so I think in some ways, a lot of external solutions have been imposed on the border for a long time.
Between 1994 and 1995, a couple of things happened that would change the course of action on the Texas-Mexico border. First of all, the United States and Mexico entered into a free trade agreement. It was heralded by commerce leaders from both sides as a breakthrough. President George Bush and President Carlos Salinas de Gortari had set the wheels in motion to seal a pact between the two neighbors.
But by the end of August of 1994, a new president, Ernesto Zedillo, would be elected. The successor of Salinas was no doubt hand-picked by the ruling party to ensure the success of the economic reforms that were sweeping over Mexico. The next step was to devalue the peso. What was set up as a measure to attract foreign investment appeared more like a setback to the common man, and it was. By the beginning of 1995, one of many peasant uprisings would occur as a reaction to Mexico's economic reforms.
Around the same time, a group of architecture students had begun studying patterns of natural erosion on the border. The idea was to observe the kinds of effects natural forces have on urban environments. The nature of erosion is such that it occurs over years and without monitoring can lead to some extraordinary effects.
So the site chosen was Guerrero Viejo, an abandoned town that dates back to the 17th century settlements on the Rio Grande of Spanish colonialists. At that time, the site had been abandoned for 40 years, since the erection of the Falcon Dam, another binational accomplishment that proved to be disastrous and destructive for communities like this on the Texas-Mexico border.
But that wasn't the only study happening on the border. In an effort to monitor the water quality of the Rio Grande River, the natural border between Texas and Mexico, the Rio Grande International Study Center had been testing water samples from 4 strategic sites along the river, up and downstream from Laredo.
The most alarming statistic was that the 2 sites below Laredo showed a dramatic increase in pollutants, up to 1,000% increase in one case. This particular case was charted at a site only 16 miles upstream from San Ignacio, Texas, another historic settlement in border history.
San Ignacio is located 34 miles south of Laredo on the north bank of the river. It is home to the River Pierce Foundation, a cultural organization that has brought artists and education to this rural community since its founding in 1990.
Conscious of the fact that the alarming pollution statistics were affecting not only San Ignacio, but everyone else downstream as well, the foundation invited the architecture students and their mentors, some artists and medical professionals, architects, engineers, and lawyers, to share their findings and experiences on the river with each other in the hopes of opening a sensitive dialogue about how commerce and development have shaped the Rio Grande from river into border, and from border into war zone.
This is a conversation that began with natural erosion, which normally begins on the borders, in the fringes. Using this once urban environment as a model, one can apply the dynamics to every aspect of urban development: the culture, the water, and the money. Intend to live in a place where the water is good to drink and the air is good to breathe. We want it to be possible that this place may be here now and in our lifetime.
It may seem like a reasonable thing to ask for, a place to live where the water is good to drink and the air is good to breathe, but in any number of places in the United States, one can find communities whose quality of life is compromised by factors stemming from economic policy and urban development. All along the Texas-Mexico border, this is evident. San Ignacio's case is most poignant. It begins a string of sites along the river that are home to structures and memories from the history of pioneer struggles on this frontier.
In 1972, San Ignacio was designated as a historical district. Its cultural treasures, including the Jesus Trevino Fort, built in 1830 by the founder of San Ignacio to protect his family and neighbors from Indian raids, and the Zaragoza Dominguez residence, a complex consisting of a residence and general store from the turn of the 20th century. This later structure is maintained by the River Pierce Foundation as part of its commitment to setting an example that by encouraging historical preservation and restoration, the quality of life along the river can also be preserved.
These ideas are directly from the San Ignacio Resolve, which was drafted by the Board of Directors of the River Pierce Foundation to call to arms those willing to support the effort to protect cultural and natural resources all along the river corridor. The opposition, however, is empowered by the fact that few people are aware that a problem, much less a solution, exists.
Several of the counties, so the 5-county region between Laredo and Brownsville, is well below the poverty line level in the United States, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. And I finally realized that when I was talking to someone in the know in the philanthropic world, and she told me, but Mario, don't you know how it's done? You have to say that you're presenting, that you're doing a project for poor border kids and you want them to go to the symphony. That's the kind of project that you need to have, and that is what gets funded, not a teacher's guide.
Mario Sanchez has worked through the Texas Historical Commission to bring to light the advantages of cultural and historical preservation in the lower Rio Grande Valley. With the Texas Historical Commission, he published an assessment of the valley's architectural resources as a teacher's guide. And he is a firm believer in cultural heritage as educational resource and as income generator.
We must present the preservation of the culture in terms of the economy. This is the only way that we can really successfully and viably present a project about historic preservation. Otherwise, it really becomes an intellectual exercise. We are really competing then with, as Margarita says, you're competing with the Mayan world, with the colonial world. And I like to say that we are also competing with the northeastern world, which regards itself as the repository of U.S. Heritage and culture. And of course, this translates into a competition for philanthropic dollars and also for federal dollars.
Competing with three worlds, then, can be exhausting in fighting for income. So a number of communities and their leaders have had to make careful decisions about how to bring and develop prosperity to their communities. In the 19th century, with cattle ranching and agriculture being a staple of the region's economy, ranching settlements along the Rio Grande like Rancho Dolores, which became San Ignacio, and Revilla, which became Guerrero Viejo, were self-sufficient enough. But after the advent of the Industrial Revolution, communities like these had to become more aggressive in securing income.
In 1950, the United States and Mexico agreed to build a dam on the river in Falcon. It would create a lake that would bring tourism to the area, and the dam would generate electric power for the whole region. However, because the shape and course of the river would change, it would also affect the surrounding communities.
Zapata, Texas was one of those. Today there is nothing left of old Zapata, except some unpaved roads leading to Zapata's part of Falcon Lake. Old Zapata and Guerrero Viejo were both flooded, but their inhabitants were moved to higher ground to start over, sacrificing the roots of their cultural heritage. In the case of old Zapata, nothing can be restored as a testament to the ingenuity of pioneers braving the frontier.
But in Guerrero Viejo, the deteriorating but elegant ruins are haunted with the memories of a more prosperous time.
And now that the water has receded in the latest long-term drought condition, all sorts of visitors have had access to the site.
We keep talking about, Guerrero being the catalyst for the border and the border issues of environment. And I mean, this is not an isolated event. This is a universal problem.
We did this whole architectural investigation of that area, and that the similarities between what's going on down here in terms of rerouting nature for this commercial thing and some of the disasters that come up about it is very interesting.
What began as an academic approach to border issues grew into a 3-day symposium called Culture, Water, and Money, the Passion of the Frontier, bringing speakers and guests from all over the world. The first day was spent in Guerrero Viejo, observing the ruins of the past resurrected by ephemeral architectural installations. The following days were spent reflecting on the reality of displaced populations, environmental disasters, the political problems that stem from the Rio Grande as a border, and how a poetic vision can lead us into finding solutions to those problems.
Among the guests present were Sue Rees and Stephan Shanabrook, artists who designed a table that pumped water from the Rio Grande across the surface of the table. The speakers in each panel, who spoke on culture, water, and money, sat behind this table, and finally, the San Ignacio Resolve was signed on this table. But what opened up from this symposium was a more serious look into why the Texas-Mexico border continues to be sacrificed.
We offer enthusiastic support for the enhancement of life along the river corridor through the encouragement of cultural activities, including historic preservation, restoration, and, when appropriate, creative engagement with historic sites. We desire expressions of compassion and advocate change and the practice of resurrection.
In the early 1800s, when people were settling the Rio Grande frontier, Spanish land grant officials had ways of securing that their communities would be beholden to a church that was one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. That much has certainly remained the same. One of the most important celebrations of Mexican Catholicism is commemorating the Passion of Christ through what is known as La Via Dolorosa on Good Friday.
Everyone remembers Mardi Gras as the blowout feast that opens the Lenten season of sacrifice and reflection. but it is Good Friday and Easter Sunday that bring the season to a close. Since the 1850s, San Ignacio has held a procession through the streets of the village to commemorate that sacrifice of compassion. But what is at the root of a sacrifice made with reluctant compassion?
In 1990, the River Pierce Foundation inaugurated its work by bringing artists from the U.S. and Mexico to involve themselves in an event to honor the Via Dolorosa procession in San Ignacio.
When the procession reached the bank of the Rio Grande, they floated a sculptural piece by artist Michael Tracy called Cruz La Pasión into the river.
It was set on fire as a burnt offering. A handful of its ashes were recovered and buried in Guerrero Viejo, in the church of Nuestra Señora del Refugio. And from those ashes rise the continually resurrected problems of the Rio Grande.
We seek a vigorous response to callous behavior and respect for our people, our histories, the places we inhabit, and where and how we work and love. We call for the definition of a natural environment not shaped by the agendas of politicians and financiers, and a creative conservation of the resources of that environment.
Conservation is teamwork, a collaborative effort by all to make the most of its gifted resource. But rarely are all involved parties able to contribute to this effort. In Laredo, the Rio Grande International Study Center, a private center that monitors the water quality of the Rio Grande, has been gauging the effects on the river of Laredo and its Mexican sister city, Nuevo Laredo. The first testing site is upstream from an area that has seen the phenomenal growth of warehousing.
Most of the agriculture is downriver, and it takes about 3 days for the water to get from Amistad to Laredo, and another day or so to get down to Falcon. Let's say some of the farmers down in the lower valley decide that they need to irrigate their crops. Well, they have to call the water master and say, I need X number of acre feet of water on a certain day. Because every drop of water in that river belongs to somebody. As a matter of fact, it's over-allocated. There's less water than there are actual water rights.
The growth of the society is no longer constrained by human capital, but by natural capital that remains to us. One of the effects of this, for example, to get more specific about the river that we're on today, is that we've always sort of acted like if we spend more money and build more infrastructure, that we just sort of can go on building the way we build our societies and then follow it up by just cleaning up our mess and spending millions and millions of dollars on wastewater treatment plants, for example. The fact is we're entering a period in which that kind of construction program simply cannot be sustained.
Okay, we have a map of the city that will be marking all of these installations and, of course, the major monuments. And then there'll be a schedule of events, including the Charles Tension Fabric Workshop, and it'll be culminating in that performance at the church.
Of all the ephemeral installations that could be most useful to people in an arid, treeless terrain, Charles Duvall's tension fabric structures stood out as an effective way of harnessing simple materials to provide an escape from the harsh border sun. Not only do his structures work, his formidable tent design, but his work has also been installed permanently in both North and South America. Here he gave a workshop for participants to build their own tension fabric structures. Not quite as elaborate as the covering in Guerrero Viejo's Hotel Flores, but basic enough to illustrate the concepts of his method.
As you can see, this is just a flat sheet of paper, and the whole thing about this technology is that it's just a deformation of the surface of the fabric. So there's no gimmicks in it really at all, other than understanding how to deform the material based on the nature of it. And then, once I pin it and see how the tension is, I watch the edge and I take out any material that isn't necessary.
Lucan is an architect who loves ruins, and I thought about him many times yesterday as we were looking at the stones which have been washed by water in the abandoned town, and thinking about the difference between an architect who is now dead, but who designed his buildings to look like ruins and to last as ruins, compared to the reality of an abandoned town and stones that were never meant to be ruins. Lucan wrote that he thought that architecture, and I think by extension engineering, was in his mind a battle between the laws of nature and the nature of man. And to the extent that engineers have taken that on as their task and understand the river as something to be controlled rather than supported and cleaned, we end up with abandoned towns, moved people, and yet no understanding of the fact that the pollution and sort of terrible environmental consequences of putting factories on the river carries everything downstream.
1 out of every 130 people on the planet belongs to a removed population, whether it be from brutal political conflicts as in China, Africa, or the Balkans, or as a result of poorly planned land development projects.
The Eurocentric and U.S.-dominated World Bank is notorious for funding such development projects in the Third World, with the intent of integrating those developing nations into the lower echelons of global economic hierarchy, securing these deals with representatives from a new entrepreneurial class who can guarantee cheap and competitive exports by maintaining low agricultural commodity prices and depressed worker wages.
The only option for the rural workforce to survive in a global economy is by bending and conforming to those options offered by ubiquitous industrialization, by sacrificing traditional ways of life, abandoning the structures of the past. Abandonment is the only word that can be used to accurately describe this movement. Abandonment is a word that was contemplated by 2 artists from Mexico who were invited to participate in the symposium. Eugenia Vargas and Elvira Santamaria choreographed a theater work in the church of Nuestra Señora del Refugio to commemorate the history and the people of Guerrero Viejo as a center of trade destroyed by the rising water of the Rio Grande.
The performance included a reference to the cattle as an important element in the culture and economy of the region, the meat as a source of food, the hides as a source of protection, the empowerment of shattering the mirror which traps the image of the past, and the healing of breaking through one's traditional capabilities.
Abandono. Desierto, desiertos digo. Los bosques sufren, las selvas sufren, los mares sufren, los lagos, los ríos. Desierto, desiertos digo, el desamparo. Desierto, desierto os digo, el abandono. Desierto, desierto os digo, la esperanza. Ahora pienso que llevo mi dolor y que eso tengo que sanar para empezar a sanar al mundo, como cada uno de nosotros. Y a veces creo que también tenemos que tomar la carga de los demás, también para salvar y sanar el mundo.
constantly break through the misconceptions imposed on us, lest we finally believe them ourselves.
Upstream from San Ignacio, there have been a number of radioactive waste dump sites proposed. The most recently reactivated proposal is that of the Sierra Blanca site. When Rick Lowerre was invited to our symposium, he had finished a case against Chemical Waste Management, one of many companies that manage chemical wastes from all over the United States by dumping it along the Texas-Mexico border.
I'm Rick Lowerre, and I'm a lawyer in Austin. I'm fortunate enough to have a law practice that allows me to work with communities and citizens on environmental issues around the state. Why would all these facilities that really are there to serve the country and the state all end up sort of pushed down to one edge of the country, one edge of the state? I think from the outside is you had this, here's an area where there's division, so if you come in, you're only going to really be fighting half of the area. A second, there is a report out which tried to identify the characteristics of people which would be least likely to fight and resist these kinds of dumps. And if you read it, you will say, well, that's the border. I don't want to just mention all the characteristics, but essentially you can think of the level of income, the religious backgrounds, a number of things that I think brought them or made them all look to the border. There was very little known about what the river looked like, but in the early 1900s, the United States and Mexico signed an agreement about water in the river. And in 1944, they redid their water treaty. And for convenience, for the political, financial convenience of all, they made the decision that groundwater and surface water were two separate things. Essentially, a lie that has been maintained for legal and political conveniences, so they could divide up the water in the river and not have to worry about how the groundwater influenced that.
The Texas-Mexico border is frequently targeted as a prime location for waste sites by waste management companies. Not only do those companies rely on a lack of education and awareness on a part of the border residents, they also rely on their own ignorance. Chemical waste management ignored the fact, in this case, that their proposed dump site would sit over a system of groundwater and aquifers that is commonly shared by Texas and Mexico. It deposits water into the Rio Grande and into Lake Amistad.
We demand a future with real access to information and a system of education that is predicated on the reasonable allocation and fostering of intellectual and financial resources.
A real access to information may also seem like a reasonable thing to ask for, but one fact that continues to be concealed is that under the many free trade agreements being drafted by government and commerce leaders today, the Third World will continue to lose its resources, and labor unions in the First World will continue to lose their influence.
What is protected, however, is the First World technology in communications, industrialization, and defense, which is constantly marketed to the Third World to help it keep current. This system keeps the Third World dependent on the obsolete refuse of the First World, while First World businesses and policymakers continue to push the process which keeps their system growing.
They want us to spend our time talking about process. They don't want us to understand who has the money, where the money goes, why people can't feed themselves, how many billionaires Salinas' privatization project has created in Mexico. I want to talk a little bit about how money affects the kind of work that I've been trying to do with lots of people in Texas and in Mexico, and why I hold these beliefs that money is the barrier, but also the key to making our work more effective. We started out really in 1991, courtesy of Michael Tracy's generous providing these facilities to have our initial meeting of what we call the Binational Network on the Environment. And this network brings together environmental groups, community groups from Texas and their counterparts in the 4 northeastern border states. And the idea is that it be entirely binational. We come on equal footing, we share information, and the overall objective is to come to some agreed upon solutions so that jointly our binational voice can be much more effective. We made progress through creation of some new binational institutions. We brought a little bit of money to the border through those institutions. We made progress by shaming the governments into trying to enforce their own environmental laws, by using the press, by using stockholder actions, by using litigation, by using a whole range of tools. We've helped build, and Mexicans themselves have built, a much stronger environmental movement, both in terms of the environment itself as well as a democratization movement, and using the environment as a key issue to push democratization in Mexico. And we've made some very strong cross-border ties that have outlasted just the immediate debate of NAFTA. It's my opinion that the peso crisis, which to anyone who is just more than a casual follower or even a casual follower of Mexico should not have been surprised by at all, that peso crisis was well known to all in the government, that it was going to happen and that would happen now and that it would happen this way. That peso crisis is going to set back the progress we've made not only on human rights, but on democratization, on advancement of disenfranchised people in Mexico and Texas. And let me just run quickly through some of the ways that I think that crisis affects people. And first of all, it's a very personal crisis for most people in Mexico who care about the environment, who have struggled to rise above their fulfilling their basic needs and have begun to see the links between environment, health, quality of life, and future for their children. These folks are people who are using what scant resources they have, either in their personal lives or in association with universities, to try and form some groups that have a little bit of longevity. Most of them don't have any staff, most of them don't have any office. They're lucky if they have a telephone, and they're really lucky if they have a fax or a computer. Peso crisis wipes out most of those groups. People who are even on the other end of the economic scale in Mexico, on the poor end, are just now trying to feed themselves. They don't have any time to worry about shit running through the street because they have to find a way to buy bread, to buy gas. And when you make less than $1 an hour and the corporate profits go to those U.S. corporations, Japanese corporations, Mexican corporations, it's hard for me not to believe it isn't money that puts people down.
In 1991, an alarming number of babies were born in Brownsville with a condition known as anencephaly. Anencephalic births are babies born without brains. This is the most severe of a few birth defects known as neural tube syndrome, in which the nervous system, spinal cord, or brain is affected by a lack of development in the neural tube during pregnancy. There is, as of yet, no scientifically proven cause for neural tube syndrome, although research has pointed to nutritional and environmental factors.
But Brownsville and Matamoros, like Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, are in an area where maquiladoras make a significant contribution to its economic growth. In 1990, over 670 of these foreign-owned plants operated along Mexico's northern border, employing more than 245,000 Mexican workers. At the time, 3/4 of all maquiladoras were discharging dangerous chemicals.
By 1995, 27 families in the lower Rio Grande Valley had been awarded $17 million in damages. Hispanic women had become the focus of a health study on the border, and the question of environmental racism had entered the argument.
But for Gregoria Rodriguez, an epidemiologist studying at the University of Texas, the pressing question was, what is causing these birth defects?
The Texas Department of Health came down to Brownsville and did a study two of the major conclusions that they drew from their study was that there was nothing to be concerned about the environment and the water in particular. And it was such an irresponsible thing of them to say, basically because if you don't have the data, even if we respect the traditional methodology of science, how can we respect something when you make a conclusion without data, without anything to base it on? The second thing was that the only statistical significant result was that all of the people were from Central American descent. And of course, they don't know their geography too well because Mexico happens to be part of North America, but they meant Mexicans. And so that, of course, meant, do Mexicans have a predisposition to have defective genes? Well, they supported their conclusion on a study in Mexico City as part of a bigger international study on birth defects, that Mexico City happens to have the highest rate of anencephaly. Well, then, we can ask the follow-up question on that. Is it that it's because we're Mexican, or is it because we happen to live in the most polluted city in the world? And of course, how can we ever ask that question? So this was the undertonings that were happening at that time, as far as we don't want these birth defects to become a hysterical issue in this community and get away from the issue that may bring us community development. That was the issue. That was the whole controversy there. Dr. Carmen Rocco, Paula Gomez, who is the director of the Brownsville Community Health Center, myself, and a few other women, we became the hysterical group of women. And I became the non-objective scientist. How can you have credibility when you speak so loudly, when you have so much anger, when you have so much passion about something? And I said, how can you believe such myth about objectivity in science? How can you believe that? Even the questions that are posed in a so-called scientific manner are molded by your funding sources, are molded by who wants to know what. So don't you come and talk to me about objectivity.
Got a temperature, water temperature, pretty stabilized, right? 25 temperature main.
Shallow, I think that current told us that. 0.135.
What does it show now? 0.1?
0.90.
If you do not have food, it's very difficult to worry about where your effluent goes when other priorities are not being met.
Lisa Brodiaga is a first-hand witness to the destruction of lives and communities on the Texas-Mexico border. She is a lawyer who runs a wildlife refuge called Refugio del Rio Grande in Harlingen that also provides help and protection for political refugees.
And the people who come through also, the Central Americans, the Mexicans, we have had Mexican refugees also come, are all increasingly desperate also, but in ways that our laws and our society does not recognize as things that are deserving of protection. You have the Refugee Act, which purports to give refuge to people who are fleeing persecution on bases of religion, national origin, political opinion, etc. But naturally, our government interprets that to be persecution as it views what politics can be and should be, so that if you're a Chinese tennis star claiming you cannot make $1 million, then you are persecuted. But if you're a Guatemalan Indian whose village has been destroyed, you are not being persecuted.
We've just learned that we had 50,000 U.S. troops in Salvador between 1983 and 1992. I went down there 7 times.
In the early 80s, the United States continued intervention in Latin America, which included arms sales in support of political regimes rubber-stamped in the name of democracy and commerce, racked up a toll of nearly 100,000 in either dead or missing persons in Guatemala alone. As a professor of law and as an international activist, Francis Tarleton Farenthold's insight into the situation provides a rare example of awareness.
Anytime you asked the embassy down there, you asked our government up here how many people we had, how many military people we had. We had 55 military advisors because that's what the law required. What was orchestrated in this country, what lobbyists were paid for by the Mexican government, to say nothing of the Fortune 500, was to push and sell NAFTA, which they did. And so during that period, you didn't get any negative press about Mexico. Nothing of the turmoil going on there, nothing of the human rights violations starting, you know, how far back, 1968 anyway, with that, when all the students were killed. I mean, more students were killed in Mexico than in Tiananmen Square, but did we ever hear anything about it? But there are all kinds of ways of concealment, denial, and lying. And I'd underline lying.
In combination with the peso crisis weakening the environmental groups, we have other counter pressures, and those are threefold. One, the Mexican government is broke. It's out of money. What meager enforcement efforts it had in the environmental arena are gone. They don't have telephones in the environmental offices. They don't have personnel. People aren't getting paid their salaries. It is only going to be the most egregious of environmental violations that get any attention in Mexico. On top of that, they now need, in addition to what their baseline was of 1 million new jobs a year, they need to make up for the massive layoffs they've experienced early in this year. Some 400,000 jobs lost in the last few months alone. And that's only what they tell us. You can bet it's a lot more. So the pressure is for those people that have a job with the Environmental Enforcement Agency to turn the other way, because they need the jobs. They need the friendly business climate to reinvigorate investment, whether that's from U.S. companies or overseas companies. And thirdly, with the peso crisis, wage rates go down again in Mexico. Now, some of us think the Maquiladora program just began not too recently. In fact, the Maquiladora program was authorized in the early 1960s, but it never took off until the 1982 devaluation of the peso made wage rates cheaper in Mexico than they were in Korea or Taiwan. This peso devaluation is going to do the same thing, and there's going to be a new influx of industrial investment. Much of that will still occur in the border because the infrastructure in the interior of Mexico is very spotty. Most companies are still going to want to locate near the border. We haven't even caught up anywhere near in cleanup or infrastructure the crisis that has been generated during the late 80s and early 1990s. And here we are opening the doors again, and we have no program in place to control the environmental or the health effects of that industrialization. We had a chance to put that cushion in place with NAFTA. We had some very modest proposals, like let's have a small fee on cross-border trades in goods, 1/4 cent, 1/2 cent, not on people but on goods. And let's establish a fund with a fee from that trade that pays for environmental cleanup, that pays for infrastructure, that helps cushion against some ups and downs in the peso that we all knew were going to come. And the response of the moneyed interest was, oh, no, 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 we can't have a tax. They called it, of course, not a fee. We can't have a tax because this is a free trade agreement. And a fee or a tax is totally contrary to those principles of free trade. Well, this is not a free trade agreement. This is a managed trade agreement. Every special interest has its little part protected in that 2 volumes worth of NAFTA text.
Hey guys, we're getting this. Y'all gonna be handling that in a minute. Don't handle that now.
Why are you wearing gloves, by the way?
Well, because I was gonna handle this after Tom gets it back, but I told the others don't handle any of the stuff that's been in the water. Okay?
Why is that?
This water is contaminated. This water is highly contaminated with bacteria, sewage, probably chemicals.
Imagine a world without global conglomerates or franchises. Ultimately, such a world can no longer exist. Our systems of education and natural environments are readily defined by the survival needs of our communities.
Maquiladoras are popping up all over Mexico, not just on the border. In 1995, only 189 of the newly approved 331 maquiladoras were located along the U.S.-Mexico border.
You do notice that there's no dumps on the other side of the border.
They go to Monterrey.
Well, they do, but they don't pick this area for some reason. And the reason is we have, or one reason may be, is we have an agreement with Mexico called the Laplace Agreement that says for 100 kilometers on either side of the border, we're going to give some special protection. And Mexico did. For whatever reasons, they closed down the hazardous waste incinerator in Tijuana that was in that zone.
Law properly used is a tool at the hand of the organizer that once the community decides what needs to be done, then they ask the lawyers, will you help us accomplish this objective? And in this context, it might be something of how do we pressure these particular polluters, not necessarily shut them down because the community is not going to want that, but into stopping the pollution. And that would be done in conjunction with other forms of publicity, which is what has helped their, help clean it up.
As a close to the symposium, we gathered on the north bank of the river to watch a final performance by artist Bill FitzGibbons called The Epiphany of 5 Rivers. He and his crew collected water from 4 Texas rivers with the intent of pouring them into the Rio Grande as an offering of unity and solidarity.
Before we start the Epiphany of 5 Rivers, I'd like to read a couple of lines from Chief Seattle in response to a request from the President of the United States to sell his land in 1852. The idea is strange to us, but if we do not own the freshness of the air, the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every meadow, every humming insect, all are holy in the memory and experience of my people. The shining water that moves in the streams and rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you our land, you must remember that it is sacred. Each ghostly reflection in the clear waters of the lakes tells of events and memories in the life of our people. The water's murmur is the voice of my father's voice.
We who have signed the San Ignacio Resolve invite you to join us in pledging a renewed commitment to the discovery of your ecology, that we may educate ourselves and learn to take action against insensitive behavior. Our hope is that we will again drink from the river, to toast its resurrection as a precious resource which nourishes the passion of the frontier.
We urge a renewed commitment to the discovery of our ecology here on the border of Mexico and the United States. We seek
a vigorous response to callous behavior and respect for our people, our histories, the places we inhabit, and where and how we work and love. We demand a future with real access to information and a system of education that is predicated on the reasonable allocation and fostering of intellectual and financial resources. We call for the definition of a natural environment not shaped by the agendas of politicians and financiers, and a creative conservation of the resources of that environment. We intend to live in a place where the water is good to drink and the air is good to breathe. We want it to be possible that this place may be here now and in our lifetime. We offer enthusiastic support for the enhancement of life along the river corridor through the encouragement of cultural activities, including historic preservation, restoration, and, when appropriate, creative engagement with historic sites. We desire expressions of compassion and advocate change and the practice of resurrection.